Hey everyone, welcome to my channel. Feel free to become members if you so desire.
Most people are under the impression that coal forms slowly in swamps over millions of years, but this view neglects the testimony of tree trunk fossils that cut across many coal layers, known as polystrate fossils. If these tree trunks were buried gradually over thousands of years, the top parts of the trees would have rotted away before they could be protected by sediment. Derek Ager, Professor of Geology at University College of Swansea, recognised this when he wrote of trees buried in coal seams. If one estimates the total thickness of the British coal measures as about 1,000 metres laid down in about 10 million years, then, assuming a constant rate of sedimentation, it would have taken 100,000 years to bury a tree 10 metres high, which is ridiculous. He then went on to say, we cannot escape the conclusion that sedimentation was at times very rapid indeed, so the slow swamp story should itself be laid to rest.
Question directly for Joe on this one. How does the evolutionary community respond to the existence of polystrata trees, and do you find their explanations convincing?
Okay, there's two parts to the answer. The first one is that they just completely ignore it, or at least that's what they used to. All right, we first started, or the first secular person to start documenting polystrate trees was Professor Ager, right, from Swansea University in Wales. And he was the first one to point out there's something seriously wrong with the way that these rock formations actually form, right, or they're supposed to be formed. But prior to even that being published, John Mackay was taking photographs of polystrate trees in Newcastle in Australia, right, to a beach where I've been to. Beautiful beach, wonderful, very difficult to get down there, but once you get down there, you're presented with some glorious fossils, including these polystrate trees. All right, they all have the same thing in common. They have the bed of coal at the bottom. Inside that bed of coal, there are no roots. Inside that bed of coal, there are no pine needles, and that's important because these are the pine trees, right? And there is no soil. And then protruding out of these coal deposits, you have this polystrate tree which sticks up through all the layers. They have no roots, they have no branches, and they have very little bark. And what little bark there is has been turned to coal. So these trees, by definition, have been ripped up, stripped, and dumped there, standing upright as they've got waterlogged, right? They've been carried along by water. Now, John Mackay was taking photographs of these in the 70s and the 80s, right, and decided he was going to publish his report on them in the Sydney Basin Coal Conference, one of the biggest coal conferences, well, in the world, but certainly in Australia, right? And at the time, there was a very prolific atheist in charge of the Sydney Basin Conference, and a very, very anti-creationist, knew John Mackay's creation guy reputation. And so when John tried to publish these photos and the reports of these trees, he simply rejected it and said there are no such thing as polystrate trees in Newcastle. Now, John had had all the papers and everything, right? And then he turned around and he said, well, if I can't do it in the Sydney Basin Coal Conference, I'll publish it in the International Coal Conference proceedings, right? And he went to publish it, and he found that it was rejected by exactly the same guy who'd rejected him on the Sydney Basin Coal Conference. Now, you could go and comment about some of the issues with peer review there, right? But here's something where they are physically saying, no, we refuse to accept even the existence of these, despite the fact I can take you there and see them, right? Now, as it happens, there's so many records and documents of these polystrate trees. They're all around the planet, right? I know about 30 different sites just in the UK where I can take you and show you, right? There's the famous trees in Yellowstone National Park. A lot of those trees that Sam put up was in Tennessee, and I've collected all up and down the coal deposits around Tennessee and seen these marvelous polystrate trees, right? What they tend to do now is say, well, okay, we're still going to accept the millions of years, but we're going to say that these formations actually were deposited very quickly by water. Now, you saw some of the example of this in what Sam was saying about these things have to be buried quickly, but there's still a bit of a contradiction there for two reasons. The first one is what they say, well, you have a swamp-like environment where all these trees are going, and then it became inundated and buried in a sort of a flash local flood, which ended up burying these trees. Well, your first problem is the swamp scenario, because the majority of these polystrate trees, which were supposedly growing in a swamp before they got inundated and it got compressed and turned into coal, the majority of these trees, they're so well preserved, we know exactly what kind of trees they are. We have their modern living counterparts, right? They're pretty much living fossils, and they don't live in swamps. They simply can't survive in swamps. So there's your first problem. From a paleobiological perspective, there's something else going on here. Secondly, we've already mentioned the fact that they've been stripped of their leaves and their branches. There's no soil that they're sitting in, so the majority of them have clearly been stripped and washed into position before settling upright due to waterlogging. Now, this shows you clearly that they haven't been growing there. Right, so that's the first problem with their explanation. The second problem is this idea of a local flood, because these deposits are certainly not local. Now, the majority of polystrate trees, and I say the majority because there are examples outside of this, but the majority of these polystrate trees are found in the Carboniferous. Carboniferous means full of carbon. It's where all the coal is from. Right, here in the UK, we've called it Upper and Lower Carboniferous, and you Americans who couldn't possibly go with our British naming of things named them Pennsylvanian and Mississippian, right? But they're exactly the same deposit, just a different name. Now, Derek Ager, the guy who I pointed out earlier, was one of the first secular scientists to point out the problem, that the Carboniferous deposits cover 180 degrees of the Earth's surface. Now, that is a very big flood. They're all identical fossils, identical coal mats, identical fossil trees, all throughout the Earth. And if it wasn't for the temperature difference, right, I could jump in one of those Doctor Who TARDIS machines and go from Tennessee in the USA to Northumberland in the UK to Newcastle in Australia, and you wouldn't be able to tell the difference from the rocks. Now, this is a very, very large flood we're actually dealing with. So they'll admit it's a flood, but what you won't ever find somebody willing to do, and this is partially the fault of the academic system, is to get them to say, well, how big was this flood, if it really was a flood? And you'll find that the flood covered pretty much all the Earth, if not all the Earth, just from the Carboniferous rocks. Add on to it the Jurassic rocks that go around the world, the Cretaceous rocks that go all around the world, and so on and so forth, and you've got a pretty clear evidence of a global flood.
That's a great answer, Joe.
You look all across the fossil record, you're seeing all of these fossil specimens and these polystrate trees that, again, have had their roots ripped off. They've got no branches, basically no bark, and they are lying vertically. Now, Creation Research has actually done some investigation into this. We've done a little experiment, taken a whole bunch of sticks and dunked them in a big sort of pot of water. And we've observed what's happened. Now, something very interesting happens. Some fall horizontally, so they just sink down as they become waterlogged, but something very interesting happens. What happens is that one end of some of them will become waterlogged. Now, this in turn will turn the stick vertical, and it'll slowly sink down like that. And it'll land vertically or at a slight angle, which shows how polystrate trees form. Again, it's a small scale, but you can scale that up because it's the same materials and it's the same water. But you know, you've got to look at certain things in the fossil record and go, hang on, how did this form?
We're at Petrified Tree in Yellowstone National Park. Hi, my name is Bob Enyart with Real Science Radio. A couple decades ago, there was an exhibit here that said that this and other petrified trees had grown in situ, in this location, on various strata, and it happened dozens of times over. Well, 1980, when Mount St. Helens blew, then a geologist, Dr. Stephen Austin, doing research there on Spirit Lake, found that trees that were destroyed in a catastrophe were floating on the lake, and as they got waterlogged, they would sink vertically. They were upright floaters, and when they hit the bottom of the lake, as sediments continued to pour in and fill up the lake, other trees came down at different layers. And so he realized that that was the model that likely produced the trees here petrified in Yellowstone. Well, in 1995, my wife and I went to Maui and had dinner in the home of the National Park Ranger there at Haleakala. His name is Mark Tanaka Sanders. We discussed the fact that these trees at Yellowstone do not have root systems. The remnants of the petrified trees in dozens of different strata on this general hillside are missing roots. The roots are abruptly broken off 2 to 3 feet from the base of the trees. You could picture this tree did not grow here. It grew elsewhere. It was knocked over in a catastrophe. It was floating with many other trees. It became waterlogged, and because of the rocks that were bound up in the roots of the tree, and for other reasons, obviously, the tree began to sink, but it was an upright floater. And it came into the bottom of what was at that time the bottom of a lake. As the sediments continued to settle from that catastrophe, other upright floaters sunk in slightly different layers. Working with Mark Tanaka Sanders, we petitioned the National Park Service to get them to remove that exhibit that misrepresented the origin of these trees. If you notice at the exhibit, there's no mention of upright floaters. There's no mention of a lack of a root system below the petrified trees here, and that's probably for a reason.
People talk glibly about science. What is science? People coming out of a university with a master's degree or a PhD, you take them into the field, and they literally don't believe anything unless there's a peer-reviewed paper. It's the only thing they accept. And you say to them, but let's observe, let's think, let's discuss. They don't do it. It's just, is it in a peer-reviewed paper or not? That's their view of science. I think it's pathetic. Gone into universities as bright young people, they come out of them brain dead, not even knowing what science means. They think it means peer-reviewed papers, etc. No, that's academia. And if a paper is peer-reviewed, it means everybody thought the same, therefore they approved it. An unintended consequence is that when new knowledge emerges, new scientific insights, they can never, ever be peer-reviewed. So we're blocking all new advances in science that are big advances. If you look at the breakthroughs in science, almost always they don't come from the center of that profession. They come from the fringe. The finest candle makers in the world couldn't even think of electric lights. They don't come from within. They often come from outside the breaks. We're going to kill ourselves because of stupidity.
I hope you enjoyed this video. Please make sure to hit that like button, it really does help, and subscribe if you enjoyed the content and want to see more, and find more of us on our main channel on Team Standing for Truth. This is Matt Man. Until next time.